In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the creation of the United Nations introduced a new arena of Cold War competition that differed fundamentally from battlefields, covert action sites, or alliance command structures, because it combined formal diplomacy, global legitimacy, and daily bureaucratic interaction inside a single institutional system. And both the United States and the Soviet Union quickly recognized that influence inside the UN would depend less on public speeches than on sustained intelligence activity embedded within its routines. From the late 1940s onward, intelligence services treated the UN not as a neutral forum, but as a contested environment where voting behavior, informal alignment, and access to information could shape global perceptions of power and legitimacy without the use of force. Soviet and Western intelligence assessments converged on the conclusion that formal equality of member states masked deep asymmetries of influence, and that the real struggle would be fought through surveillance of delegations, cultivation of diplomatic cover assets, monitoring of internal communications, and systematic analysis of how blocs formed and dissolved across committees, agencies, and specialized bodies. Early Cold War voting patterns revealed that resolutions themselves were often less important than the coalitions behind them, because bloc behavior signaled shifts in alignment, pressure points within emerging states, and opportunities for leverage, making vote counting a core intelligence function rather than a purely political exercise. Both sides developed dedicated analytic units tasked with tracking UN voting records, attendance patterns, amendment sponsorship, and procedural maneuvers, treating these indicators as intelligence signals that revealed more than public rhetoric ever could. The Soviet Union approached the UN as a controlled exposure environment, where its delegations operated under strict internal discipline, coordinated closely with intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, and reported extensively on the behavior of other missions, particularly those of newly independent states whose loyalties were fluid and whose diplomatic practices were still forming. Western intelligence services, while operating within looser internal structures, also expanded surveillance of UN activity, recognizing that open access institutions provided unparalleled opportunities to observe rival diplomats, identify emerging influencers, and collect information through routine interaction rather than clandestine penetration. The concentration of foreign officials in New York, Geneva, and other UN hubs created dense social and professional networks that intelligence services exploited systematically, as receptions, committee meetings, and informal consultations became venues for information collection, recruitment assessment, and influence mapping. Diplomatic cover proved especially valuable in this environment because the UN normalized constant interaction across ideological lines, allowing intelligence officers to meet targets under the guise of negotiation, coordination, or procedural consultation without arousing suspicion. Surveillance inside and around UN facilities became an accepted background condition of Cold War diplomacy, with both blocs assuming that offices, communications, and movements were monitored, yet continuing to operate within the system because the intelligence benefits outweighed the risks. Information warfare inside the UN took subtle forms, as delegations selectively leaked draft resolutions, internal reports, or procedural disputes to shape narratives and undermine rival positions, often without direct attribution, blurring the line between diplomacy and intelligence activity. The Soviet bloc placed particular emphasis on internal discipline and message control, ensuring that public statements aligned precisely with internal guidance, while intelligence officers monitored any deviation that might signal vulnerability or dissent. Western governments, while more tolerant of variation, nonetheless relied heavily on intelligence reporting from UN missions to anticipate Soviet tactics, assess pressure campaigns, and identify which delegations were being targeted for alignment shifts. The expansion of UN specialized agencies created additional intelligence terrain as technical bodies dealing with labor, health, development, and communications generated data, reports, and access that could be exploited for strategic insight, particularly regarding economic conditions and political stability in developing states. Both sides recognized that influence inside these agencies could shape long-term norms and standards, making intelligence competition a sustained bureaucratic process rather than a series of dramatic confrontations. Internal UN procedures themselves became objects of intelligence interest, as rules governing agenda, setting, committee referral, and voting thresholds provided opportunities to advance or block initiatives quietly, and mastery of these procedures often mattered more than numerical majority. As decolonization accelerated in the 1950s and early 1960s, the intelligence stakes inside the UN increased sharply because the influx of new member states transformed voting arithmetic and created a large pool of delegations vulnerable to pressure, persuasion, and information operations. Intelligence services devoted increasing resources to mapping personal relationships within these missions, assessing susceptibility to influence, and tracking shifts in alignment that could signal broader geopolitical movement. The UN thus evolved into a living intelligence laboratory, where ideological competition played out through daily interaction, procedural maneuvering, and the constant exchange of information rather than through overt confrontation. By the mid-1960s, both superpowers had institutionalized UN-focused intelligence operations as permanent components of their foreign policy apparatus, recognizing that control over narratives, voting behavior, and access within the organization could shape international outcomes even when military options were constrained. The competition inside the UN system demonstrated that Cold War conflict extended far beyond battlefields and covert operations, embedding itself within institutions designed for cooperation and transforming them into arenas where intelligence, diplomacy, and power projection merged into a continuous struggle for influence, conducted under the cover of legitimacy and law. As the 1950s gave way to the early 1960s, the intelligence competition inside the United Nations intensified as both superpowers adapted to an institution that was expanding rapidly in size, complexity, and political significance. Because the acceleration of decolonization transformed the UN from a relatively contained diplomatic forum into a global arena where dozens of new states entered with fluid alignments and limited institutional experience, creating conditions in which intelligence activity could decisively shape outcomes. Voting blocs became the primary objects of analysis and influence, as intelligence services moved beyond tracking individual resolutions to mapping coalition behavior across committees, identifying which delegations acted as anchors, which followed regional leaders, and which could be shifted through targeted pressure or inducement. Soviet intelligence devoted substantial effort to consolidating disciplined voting within the socialist bloc, while simultaneously cultivating influence among newly independent states by presenting alignment as an extension of anti-colonial legitimacy rather than ideological submission, a strategy reinforced through coordinated messaging across UN debates, bilateral diplomacy, and information channels. Western intelligence services responded by refining their own analytic tools, developing detailed voting matrices that tracked changes over time, identified swing delegations, and assessed the impact of procedural tactics such as abstentions, absences, and amendments. recognizing that apparent defeats or victories often masked deeper shifts in alignment. Surveillance within UN facilities expanded in scope and sophistication during this period, as both sides sought insight into internal deliberations that were formally opaque but practically accessible through observation, interception, and human reporting, treating committee rooms, offices, and informal meeting spaces as environments where information could be collected through proximity rather than penetration. Diplomatic cover remained central, as intelligence officers embedded within missions operated openly as diplomats, enabling routine contact with counterparts from rival blocs and newly independent states alike, and allowing recruitment assessment and influence cultivation to proceed under the protection of normal diplomatic activity. The UN's emphasis on transparency and procedure paradoxically facilitated intelligence collection, because public documents, draft texts, and recorded statements provided a rich baseline against which private reporting could be evaluated, enabling analysts to detect discrepancies between rhetoric and behavior that signaled internal debate or external pressure. Information warfare within the UN became increasingly procedural rather than declarative, as delegations used agenda control, committee referrals, and drafting language to advance narratives subtly, shaping outcomes without overt confrontation. And intelligence services monitored these maneuvers closely to anticipate shifts and counter them through preemptive coordination. The Soviet approach emphasized centralized control and reporting discipline, with delegations operating under detailed guidance and intelligence officers ensuring that messaging and voting remained aligned with broader strategy, while also collecting extensive information on the tactics and priorities of Western missions. Western governments, operating within more decentralized systems, relied heavily on reporting from UN missions to compensate for internal variation, using intelligence analysis to synthesize disparate diplomatic signals into coherent assessments of bloc behavior. The growth of UN specialized agencies during this period expanded the intelligence terrain further, as bodies dealing with development, trade, labor, and communications generated technical data and political access that could be leveraged for strategic insight, particularly regarding the economic vulnerabilities and political stability of emerging states. Intelligence services treated participation in these agencies as opportunities to collect information indirectly, influence norms, and build relationships that could later be activated in political forums. The physical concentration of delegations in New York and Geneva intensified social intelligence collection, as receptions, working lunches, and informal consultations provided venues for assessing personalities, internal hierarchies, and susceptibility to persuasion, making social behavior itself a source of strategic information. Both sides increasingly assumed that communications were monitored, yet continued to operate within the system because the intelligence value of access outweighed the risks, normalizing surveillance as an ambient condition of UN diplomacy. As the number of member states grew, so too did the complexity of coalition management, and intelligence services refined methods for segmenting targets by region, ideology, and economic interest, recognizing that influence strategies effective in one context might fail in another. The UN thus became a dynamic intelligence ecosystem, where information flowed continuously through formal and informal channels, and where success depended on sustained presence, procedural mastery, and the ability to translate observation into timely influence. By the early 1960s, intelligence competition inside the UN had matured into a permanent, bureaucratized activity embedded within diplomatic practice, shaping how both superpowers approached international legitimacy and demonstrating that control over institutions could be as strategically consequential as control over territory. As the mid-1960s unfolded, Intelligence competition inside the United Nations entered a phase defined by scale and routine rather than novelty, because both superpowers had accepted that the UN was not a temporary battleground, but a permanent environment in which influence had to be maintained continuously, monitored methodically, and adjusted incrementally in response to shifting alignments. By this stage, voting blocs were no longer treated as static ideological groupings, but as fluid coalitions whose behavior varied by issue area, committee, and procedural context, requiring intelligence services to track not only how states voted, but why they voted as they did, and under what conditions those patterns might change. Analysts increasingly focused on the mechanics of bloc cohesion, identifying which delegations exercised informal leadership, which acted as brokers between groups, and which were susceptible to pressure through economic, diplomatic, or reputational means. And this granular mapping allowed both sides to move beyond blunt ideological appeals toward targeted influence strategies. The Soviet Union refined its approach by leveraging its centralized system to coordinate messaging across delegations, intelligence officers, and allied missions, ensuring that voting behavior, procedural tactics, and public rhetoric reinforced one another and projected an image of cohesion that amplified influence beyond numerical strength. Western governments, facing a more heterogeneous alliance structure, relied heavily on intelligence synthesis to anticipate bloc shifts, using UN reporting to identify emerging leaders among newly independent states and to assess when regional solidarity might override ideological alignment. Surveillance activity within and around UN facilities became increasingly normalized during this period, as both sides treated observation of meetings, monitoring of movements, and collection of open-source material as routine intelligence tasks rather than exceptional operations, integrating them into daily diplomatic practice. Information warfare evolved accordingly, with delegations using selective disclosure, strategic ambiguity, and procedural delay to shape narratives and outcomes subtly, while intelligence services monitored these tactics to distinguish genuine policy positions from signaling and maneuver. The expansion of UN peacekeeping and technical missions created additional intelligence vectors, as field reports, logistical data, and staffing decisions provided insight into conditions on the ground in regions otherwise difficult to access, and both blocs sought to influence these processes to shape the flow of information upward into the UN system. Intelligence officers attached to missions analyze staffing patterns, reporting language, and budget allocations as indicators of political intent, treating bureaucratic detail as a source of strategic signal. The role of diplomatic cover remained central, as intelligence personnel embedded within delegations could interact openly with counterparts and targets under the guise of routine coordination, enabling sustained observation and relationship building that would have been impossible in more closed environments. Social settings continued to play a critical role, as receptions and informal consultations allowed intelligence services to assess personal relationships, detect shifts in attitude, and identify emerging fault lines within delegations, reinforcing the importance of human observation alongside document analysis. Both sides recognized that influence inside the UN depended on credibility as much as pressure, and intelligence assessments increasingly evaluated how overt tactics might backfire by provoking resistance or driving delegations toward rival blocs, prompting more subtle approaches that emphasized persuasion, procedural advantage, and coalition management. The Soviet bloc maintained strict internal discipline, but even within this structure, intelligence reporting revealed concerns about overreach, as excessive pressure risked alienating potential partners among non-aligned states, whose cooperation was issue-specific rather than ideological. Western intelligence similarly cautioned against assuming that numerical superiority translated into control, noting that procedural setbacks or symbolic defeats could have outsized political impact despite favorable vote counts. By the late 1960s, the UN had become a mature intelligence environment in which success was measured less by dramatic victories than by sustained influence over agenda setting, narrative framing, and coalition behavior, all of which required continuous monitoring rather than episodic intervention. This period demonstrated that intelligence competition inside the UN was not a series of discrete operations, but an ongoing process embedded in the organization's daily life, shaping outcomes incrementally through attention to detail, timing, and relationship management. As global politics grew more complex, the UN's role as an intelligence arena expanded accordingly, reinforcing the reality that Cold War competition extended into every institutional space where legitimacy, information, and alignment could be contested under the cover of diplomacy. As the mid-1970s unfolded, intelligence competition inside the United Nations increasingly reflected the maturation of Cold War rivalry into a contest of endurance and perception rather than ideological conversion, because both superpowers recognized that control inside the UN system depended less on winning individual votes than on shaping the institutional environment in which those votes occurred. Intelligence services on both sides concentrated on agenda formation, committee leadership, and procedural timing. Understanding that influence exercised early in the decision process often mattered more than visible pressure at the final vote. This shift placed greater emphasis on long-term observation and bureaucratic literacy, as intelligence officers embedded within delegations tracked how draft texts evolved, how informal consultations altered outcomes, and how subtle changes in language signaled underlying political compromise or resistance. Voting blocs continued to fragment along functional rather than ideological lines, and intelligence analysis increasingly treated development finance, sanctions regimes, and peacekeeping mandates as distinct arenas with their own coalition logic, requiring tailored influence strategies rather than uniform bloc discipline. The Soviet Union adjusted by focusing its intelligence effort on preserving core support while exploiting procedural leverage to limit unfavorable outcomes, recognizing that outright control was no longer feasible, but that obstruction and delay could still shape results. Western governments similarly refined their approach, using intelligence from UN missions to identify where compromise was possible and where resistance was entrenched, enabling more efficient allocation of diplomatic capital. Surveillance within the UN remained pervasive but normalized, as both sides assumed that observation of movements, meetings, and communications was constant, and intelligence services integrated this ambient collection into routine analysis rather than treating it as exceptional. Information warfare took increasingly institutional forms as delegations sought to influence the content and tone of reports, resolutions, and official statements through drafting committees and expert groups, embedding narratives within bureaucratic output that would persist beyond individual sessions. Intelligence officers monitored these processes closely, treating report language and procedural outcomes as strategic signals rather than neutral administrative detail. The role of diplomatic cover remained indispensable, as intelligence personnel operating openly as diplomats could maintain continuous access to both rivals and potential partners, allowing influence assessment and relationship cultivation to proceed without the risk associated with clandestine penetration. Social interaction continued to generate valuable intelligence, as informal exchanges revealed attitudes, priorities, and internal constraints that were rarely expressed in formal settings. Both blocs increasingly emphasized credibility and restraint, as intelligence assessments warned that excessive pressure or visible manipulation could provoke backlash among states sensitive to sovereignty and legitimacy, undermining long-term influence. This recognition reinforced a preference for indirect methods, including coalition shaping, procedural advantage, and narrative framing, over overt coercion. By the mid-1970s, intelligence competition inside the UN had become a continuous, low-visibility process embedded in the organization's daily operations, shaping outcomes incrementally through attention to detail rather than dramatic intervention. This phase underscored that the UN's strategic significance lay in its capacity to institutionalize influence, as decisions and norms established through its procedures could reverberate far beyond individual votes. As global politics grew more complex, the intelligence contest within the UN mirrored that complexity, requiring sustained presence, analytical depth, and patience rather than decisive action. The experience of this period demonstrated that Cold War intelligence competition inside international institutions was not a deviation from diplomacy, but an extension of it, transforming the UN into a space where information, legitimacy, and power were contested continuously under the guise of formal cooperation. As the early 1980s progressed, intelligence competition inside the United Nations increasingly reflected an environment in which information itself had become the primary currency of influence, because the ability to anticipate shifts, interpret procedural signals, and understand internal dynamics now mattered more than the capacity to mobilize large voting blocks on demand. Intelligence services on both sides treated the UN as an early warning system for geopolitical change, analyzing debates, draft language, and delegation behavior as indicators of pressure building within regions or alliances long before crises reached military dimensions. Voting patterns were no longer read simply as expressions of alignment, but as negotiated outcomes shaped by domestic constraints, economic dependencies, and reputational considerations, requiring intelligence analysts to integrate UN reporting with broader political and economic intelligence to produce meaningful assessments. The Soviet Union increasingly used its UN presence to monitor the cohesion of its partners and clients, treating deviations in voting or rhetoric as signals of internal strain that might require political or material intervention, while Western intelligence services used similar indicators to assess the durability of alliances and the effectiveness of influence campaigns. Surveillance within the UN environment continued as a normalized backdrop, with both sides assuming observation of meetings, movements, and communications as a constant, yet increasingly relying on open-source material and human reporting rather than intrusive collection to avoid reputational risk. Information warfare during this period focused on shaping interpretation rather than outcomes, as delegations sought to frame issues through language. Procedural, sequencing, and expert testimony that would influence how events were understood internationally, even if immediate decisions were unfavorable. Intelligence officers monitored these framing efforts closely, recognizing that narrative dominance within UN documents and reports could have lasting impact on legitimacy, sanctions, and future action. The role of specialized agencies remained significant, as technical reports on development, health, labor, and communications provided politically salient data that could be used to justify policy positions, making access to and influence over these bodies a persistent intelligence priority. Diplomatic cover continued to offer unparalleled access, allowing intelligence personnel to operate openly within a dense network of contacts while gathering insight through routine interaction rather than covert penetration. Social intelligence retained its importance as personal relationships, reputational standing, and informal influence often determined whether procedural initiatives succeeded or stalled, reinforcing the value of sustained presence over episodic intervention. Both blocs increasingly emphasized restraint, as intelligence assessments warned that overt manipulation, or heavy-handed pressure, could erode credibility and provoke resistance among states sensitive to sovereignty, particularly within an institution built on the principle of formal equality. By the mid-1980s, intelligence competition inside the UN had become a disciplined practice of observation, interpretation, and subtle influence, embedded within diplomatic routine and constrained by institutional norms. This maturation reflected a broader understanding that the UN's strategic value lay in its capacity to reveal patterns of global change and to legitimize narratives rather than to deliver decisive victories. The intelligence contest thus operated continuously beneath the surface of formal diplomacy, shaping how both superpowers perceived the international system and adjusted their strategies accordingly, even as overt confrontation receded. This phase underscored that in the late Cold War, intelligence competition inside the UN was less about controlling outcomes than about managing uncertainty through sustained access to information, alignment signals, and institutional processes that translated global complexity into actionable insight. As the late 1980s approached, intelligence competition inside the United Nations increasingly mirrored the broader transformation of the Cold War itself, as ideological rigidity gave way to uncertainty, institutional inertia, and the challenge of interpreting change rather than enforcing alignment, and both superpowers adjusted their intelligence priorities accordingly. The UN remained a central observation platform, but its value now lay less in coalition engineering and more in its ability to surface early indicators of political transition, regime stress, and shifting international norms through debate patterns, sponsorship behavior, and procedural realignment. Intelligence services devoted growing attention to how delegations framed domestic reform, economic restructuring, and sovereignty concerns in multilateral language, treating these shifts as signals of deeper political change rather than rhetorical variation. Soviet intelligence reporting from UN missions increasingly focused inward, monitoring not only adversary behavior, but the reactions of allied and client states to evolving Soviet positions, using voting divergence, abstention, or silence as indicators of uncertainty and recalibration within its own sphere. Western intelligence similarly interpreted UN activity as a barometer of systemic change, assessing how rapidly states adjusted to new signals and which institutions adapted or resisted, recognizing that the pace of alignment often lagged behind political reality. Surveillance within UN facilities remained constant, but increasingly conservative, as both sides prioritized legitimacy and reputation in an environment where overt manipulation could undermine long-term influence during a period of transition. Information warfare shifted toward narrative stabilization rather than confrontation, as delegations sought to manage expectations, avoid escalation, and preserve flexibility by embedding ambiguity within official language. And intelligence officers tracked these textual strategies as carefully as they once tracked bloc voting. The UN Secretariat and specialized agencies gained renewed intelligence significance, as their reports and policy recommendations increasingly reflected contested interpretations of reform, development, and security, making bureaucratic language a key arena for influence and observation. Diplomatic cover continued to provide the structural foundation for intelligence activity, allowing officers to maintain access, observe interactions, and assess shifting relationships without attracting undue attention. Social intelligence remained critical as informal exchanges revealed uncertainty, hesitation, and adaptation that formal statements concealed, offering insight into how delegations navigated a rapidly changing strategic environment. Both blocs increasingly treated intelligence competition inside the UN as a means of managing transition rather than rivalry, using information to reduce surprise and anticipate adjustment rather than to coerce or dominate. By the end of the 1980s, the UN had become a space where the Cold War's erosion could be observed in real time, as procedural habits persisted even as underlying alignments softened and ideological confrontation receded. The intelligence contest within the institution did not disappear, but it transformed, shifting from active manipulation to careful interpretation as the risks of misreading change outweighed the benefits of aggressive influence. This final phase demonstrated that the UN's enduring value as an intelligence environment lay in its continuity, as it provided a stable platform through which gradual change could be monitored and understood amid systemic upheaval. The experience underscored that intelligence competition inside international institutions adapts to political context, persisting even as the nature of rivalry evolves, and that access to information, relationships, and procedural insight remains strategically consequential even when ideological conflict wanes. As the Cold War drew toward its conclusion, the intelligence struggle inside the UN system stood as a testament to how deeply intelligence activity had become embedded in multilateral diplomacy, shaping perceptions, managing uncertainty, and providing continuity through one of the most profound transitions in modern international politics. In the final assessment of Cold War intelligence competition inside the United Nations system, the historical record shows an enduring contest defined less by decisive victories than by continuous presence, observation, and interpretation. Because the UN functioned as a permanent arena in which legitimacy, information, and alignment intersected daily under the cover of formal diplomacy. From the late 1940s through the final years of the Cold War, intelligence services treated the organization not as a neutral stage, but as a living system whose procedures, voting behavior, and internal dynamics revealed strategic intentions and political change long before they were visible elsewhere. The competition unfolded through surveillance that became normalized, diplomatic cover that enabled routine access, and analytic disciplines that transformed procedural detail into strategic insight, allowing both superpowers to monitor allies, rivals, and emerging states simultaneously. Voting blocs, once the primary objects of influence, evolved into fluid coalitions whose behavior required constant reassessment, reinforcing the importance of longitudinal analysis over episodic intervention. Information warfare inside the UN took institutional form, as language, agenda control, and bureaucratic output became vehicles for shaping narratives that could outlast individual debates or resolutions. Specialized agencies and secretariats emerged as critical intelligence environments, providing data and access that informed broader assessments of economic stability, political legitimacy, and strategic alignment. Throughout the Cold War, intelligence competition inside the UN remained constrained by the organization's norms, forcing both sides to balance influence against legitimacy and to operate within procedural boundaries that limited overt coercion. This constraint did not reduce strategic value, but rather shaped methods, favoring subtlety, patience, and sustained engagement over dramatic action. By the late 1980s, as ideological confrontation receded and uncertainty increased, the UN's role as an intelligence platform became even more pronounced, offering a continuous stream of signals through which systemic change could be observed and interpreted. The persistence of intelligence activity inside the organization underscored that multilateral institutions do not dilute competition, but relocate it, embedding rivalry within routines designed for cooperation. In retrospect, the Cold War struggle inside the United Nations demonstrates how intelligence can operate most effectively, not in secrecy alone, but in proximity to legitimacy, access, and daily interaction, shaping perceptions and behavior incrementally rather than through force. The UN did not resolve the Cold War, but it provided a space in which its dynamics could be monitored, influenced, and managed, making intelligence competition inside the institution a quiet but essential component of global strategy. As the Cold War ended, this contest did not vanish, but transformed, leaving behind a legacy of institutionalized intelligence practice that illustrated how power, information, and legitimacy intertwine within international organizations long after overt confrontation fades.